Now, talks to secure a ceasefire in Gaza are expected to take place between US and Israeli officials in the coming hours. The delivery of aid has become a main sticking point in any negotiations. It comes as the World Health Organization has demanded full access for aid into Gaza, describing the situation there as man-made mass starvation. The head of the organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, said a large proportion of Gaza's population was starving because of Israel's blockade of the territory. His words follow a warning by more than 100 aid agencies that civilians in Gaza are wasting away. I want to speak to Lord MacDonald, who's a former permanent Undersecretary and head of the Diplomatic Service at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to be with us today. We've heard some strong words, not just from the humanitarian agencies, but also from governments in the last couple of days. Can the international community make any difference at all at the moment with Gaza?
One country, the United States, and in particular one man, President Trump, can make a difference. Everybody else agrees that what is happening is disproportionate. Although Israel suffered a tragedy on the 7th of October, what they're doing right now can't be justified. But only the United States has the leverage to make that unhappiness felt in Jerusalem.
So beyond, for the UK in particular, I mean, if you were still advising a Prime Minister these days, what would your advice be? And would some of that be putting the pressure on by, for example, recognising a state of Palestine, which has been talked about?
It has indeed been talked about. I personally do not think it would make any difference. It would be a curious justification to recognise a state to punish another state. The international community agreed criteria for statehood 90 years ago, and Palestine does not meet two of the three fundamental criteria. So although it has a permanent population, it does not have defined borders which it controls, and it does not have an agreed government. So I think for technical reasons, it would be a mistake to recognize a state of Palestine.
Now, you were also an ambassador to Israel, I understand. What pressure do you think, I mean, you mentioned the role of the US, but what pressure in particular from the US would Israel respond to?
Israel depends on the US for all its materiel. So all the weapons, or nearly all, it makes quite a lot itself, but the imports are overwhelmingly American. And we saw American influence, American power at the end of the so-called 12-day war against Iran, when Israel continued the bombing raids after President Trump had announced an end. He was furious. His language was unmistakably unhappy, and Israel turned back its fighters as they were flying towards Iran. So America and Trump have the necessary influence.
So you mentioned, we talked about that there are 28 countries that yesterday got together to call for a ceasefire. You've said that only really the US makes a difference. But is it really a situation now where there's no international kind of community being able to intervene when there is a dire situation? People might remember the situations in Bosnia or Libya. What's happened to the concept of the responsibility to protect?
This would have to go through the United Nations Security Council. The United States has very consistently vetoed any resolution which Israel did not like. So organizing such an international response through the United Nations would, I think, be impossibly difficult, given the difference in opinion between Washington and the rest of the international community.
Lord Simon MacDonald, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on the subject. Thank you. Let's speak to our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell, who's in Jerusalem for us. So, Yolande, we've got the context at the moment of these ceasefire talks between the Israelis and the Americans starting up, but with these dire warnings from all the aid agencies and countries as well.
That's right. There is a growing sense that things are really reaching a critical point. You've had many of Israel's closest allies, excluding the US, calling for an end to the war this week. You've had warnings from the UN and from other aid agencies about mass starvation. The WHO underlining that this is man-made mass starvation that we're talking about. And, you know, yet the talks have been going on in Doha, the indirect talks between Israel and Hamas to try to agree a new 60-day ceasefire and hostage release deal. They have not produced results so far. Now, what really people had put a lot of hope in were these reports that in the course of the day we were supposed to have a meeting between President Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and the Israeli minister who's in charge of the negotiations file, Ron Dermer. But just in the past hour or so, we've been having reports from Israeli media suggesting that the latest response that has come through from Hamas to the deal that is on the table, that Israel feels that has not gone far enough. And so there are questions being asked about whether that meeting will take place between the US envoy and the Israeli minister. There had been also reports that a Qatari envoy would go along as well. Of course, that could be, just a tactic to put more pressure on Hamas. It's not totally clear, but all hopes are that there could be a breakthrough in talks, but we're really far from that still.
And given the warnings that we've had from the WHO and many others in the last few days, is there any progress on getting more aid in?
So we did have a short statement from the Israeli military body that controls the crossings into Gaza. Of course, what we've been hearing from them and from the Israeli military is that the real hold-ups have been happening on the Gaza side of the crossings. So there are hundreds of lorry loads worth of aid that have been sitting there. They blamed the UN and international aid organisations for failure to pick that up. But the UN has been really stressing that it faces huge logistical challenges getting the military coordination it needs to distribute that aid inside Gaza, stressing that it's Israel that controls the crossings, the aid that's allowed in and when it's allowed. And it's been saying too that it's been failing to get the Israeli military guarantees that it asks for, that when desperate people approach its lorries with aid going into the Gaza Strip, that they will not be shot at by Israeli forces in the area.
Yolande Knell, thank you very much indeed.